I turned on my microphone. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly I tell you that if the 2 of you on earth agree about anything they ask for, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but it says here 77, or 7 times 70 times. And therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants, and he began the settlement. With the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of coal. And that man was brought to him. And then it tells the story of how that man is forgiven his debt. Large, huge debt. I'll talk about that late in the sermon. And then that man who was forgiven a large debt is asked by another servant if he could be forgiven a small debt. And the man does not forgive him, and therefore loses his own sense of forgiveness. And as the story goes, is trapped by his lack of grace in the life of someone else who needs forgiveness, and therefore experiences suffering in his life. Went to get my teeth cleaned this week, Friday. It's good to know, isn't it? Preacher gets his teeth cleaned every once in a while. And it was a kind of a mixed up thing, because I was going. There were 3 George Gastons who were supposed to be there at 11 o'clock on Friday. 3 of us. I know that 2 of us, one is my son and one is myself, and there was a mix-up there. That happens to us always. But there's another George Gaston out there that I don't know, and he lives over in the Katy area. It always intrigues me. I didn't get to meet him that day, but I'm always intrigued when somebody carries the name Gaston around. I find myself wondering what they're like and what their family was like and what it taught them and how they lived their lives, and am I somehow related to them by, down the line someplace? I could go back and trace it maybe and come up with that. By the way, I went up to Abilene once to do some teaching at Hardin-Simmons and ran into a professor who was there from North Carolina, and his last name was Gaston. I walked in, he said, I've been looking forward to meeting you, Dr. Gaston. He said, and professors always have to use that word, Dr. Gaston. He said, I've been looking forward to meeting you because I want to find out if your family comes from North Carolina. I said, well, I think so. I think there's a Gastonia over there. My brother's done some research. I was just so intrigued by him. He said, I know which family you're from then. He said, you're from the Black Dirt family. And he said, I'm from the more red dirt. That's the poor people. You're from the rich people. I thought, well, how in the world does he know all of this about Gastons? I'll tell you one thing I know about my family. My little universe of Gaston that I grew up with was not a real united entity. My parents had troubles. They fought, they struggled, they stayed together, they loved each other, they cared, they worked things out. My dad became a Christian when he was 45, and so that affected how he grew, and he became really, truly a much better man before he died at age 58. But he was from a very dysfunctional family, and one of the crises that I remember so deeply in my heart was one that happened when I was probably in high school. I was in high school, and my father was talking in the family, my mother and my brother and sister and I, about how it had turned out that he'd gotten into a disagreement with his 2 brothers. And it was all over the fact that one of the brothers who had a wife who became very emotionally ill and had to be hospitalized for a long period of time, and the youngest child that they had went to live with another brother. So the other brother kept this child for 2 years, he and his wife, and they fell in love with this child. They wanted this child to be there with them. And when time came, the wife was well on the oldest brother's side, and she came home and they wanted their child back. And they didn't want to give the child back. They had grown to love the child and felt like it would not be best for this child, and so they got into a legal fight about that. And as they struggled over that, one of the brothers came to see my father and said, "Look, I need for you to stand up for me. I need for you to tell the judge when they ask you that this is what needs to happen." And my dad said, "I can't do that." He said, "You're both my brothers." See, by this time he had already begun understanding something about what it meant to be a Christian. He was struggling with how you resolve conflicts in this family of theirs. And that brother said to him, "If you can't stand up for me, I'm through with you. And I will not even come to your funeral when you die." Now you know, here I am probably, 50 years later, 60 years, I don't know. It's a lot longer since then. And I remember deeply the pain that my family felt over the inability that we had to resolve this difference. And how my father, when he died, knew that his youngest brother would not be there when he died. Don't you wish that we knew how to get along and we knew how to resolve our differences in life? And how many of us today in this room, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because it's going to be all of us, have had these struggles in life where we've experienced this kind of disagreement, this kind of pain that comes when somebody else hurts us, when somebody does something to us that they shouldn't be doing. Jesus would speak of it here as when your brother or sister sins. And really, another translation puts it another way of translating it, says when your brother or sister sins against you. When someone in your close circle of love, and it would be the church or it would be your immediate family, when those persons do something against you that is wrong and wrongful, you struggle with that. And what Jesus is wanting to do is to point out a way in which we can resolve the differences that we have in our lives. And he teaches them that day. And incidentally, the 18th chapter of Matthew is a wonderful chapter in which Jesus is talking about people not lording it over others, that we must become servants of others, that we want to look out for the children in this world. And he was saying to them that we want to go after those who are lost, those who wander away from the fold. We want to love them and draw them together. And then he says to them, I just need to teach you that when someone hurts you, when they do something that's wrong, there's a way to deal with this. Jesus wants us, God wants us to be people of peace. I said that earlier today. He wants us to learn how to live together. Now, I know that there are conflict times in life. And by the way, Jesus caused some conflict, didn't he? He ran some money changers out of the temple. Jesus died on a cross, a violent death. What he said to his disciples and followers once is, "I come not to bring you peace, but a sword." Meaning I've come to disturb the lives of people. I've come to, in some way, draw you away from the brokenness that is keeping you from God so that you can know real peace in life. He wants us to know peace and live in peace. And one of the ways in which peace comes is as his people, his church, his family learns how to live together. And we communicate that unity, that love to the world that is around us. And what he's doing here, I think, and these are the teachings that I draw from it. One is he's telling these folks that you need to avoid being people who have unrealistic expectations about conflict. He says, if your brother or sister sins against you, and when he does that, he's drawing the possibility that that could happen. And remember that he says forgiveness is how many times? 70 times 7? Which means he's anticipating that we're going to run into a whole lot of opportunity for giving forgiveness to other people. One of the things that hurts us in this ability to resolve differences is we have an expectation that other people ought to treat us right. And we're going to treat other people right. And the truth be known, friends, is that we all fall down, don't we? We all have times when we don't live up to what we promise and what we know we ought to do. And it is better for us to come at life thinking to ourselves, I'm praying and hopeful, and I want to trust that other people are going to treat me right. But the truth is, I'm also going to be ready knowing that others may not treat me the way that I need to be treated and want to be treated. If you live with what I would call a legalistic kind of position in life, you're expecting so much of other people, and it's hard for other people to live up to that or to want to live with you. Or if you're so tender and so sensitive and you feel like I can't handle other people hurting me, then that's going to make it real difficult. You're going to be discouraged a whole lot of life. So what I've tried to learn to do through the years is to believe. I want the best. I don't want other people to sin against me, but I am not surprised when they do. Really, when any of them do it. It hurts more when it's closer to home, but I'm not surprised when people fall down. We are an imperfect lot. You know, Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife, she had this thing. She saw a sign on the side of the road as she and Billy were driving across the country. She said one time, came through a zone, a construction zone, and she came to the end of it, and there was a sign that said, end of construction, thank you for your patience. She said, I want that on my tombstone. End of construction, thank you for your patience. And that's pretty true, isn't it? There's folks, we are fallen people, and that's going to be what we're going to experience in life. So in terms of living together, let's just start to accept that. I want you to also say that you've got to be responsible for the problems that come up in your life, for the sin that gets expressed against you, for the struggle, the disagreement that comes in your life. What does Jesus say? Go. You go. You're the one who feels hurt, who is wounded, who has problems. You do your best to reach toward the person that you consider to be the offending partner or the offending person. And remember, he's talking here about brothers and sisters, meaning those who are close to us. I think it's a principle that would apply if Jesus would say to the whole wide world that this is how we ought to be. You ought to be moving toward other people who are the problem as you see it in life, wanting to figure out if we can resolve this thing. And when you go, you want to respond to them in such a way that helps them to listen. He says, when you go, they hopefully will listen. But what that means is that when we go, we need to be able to say words, use words, and to enter in a conversation that is a dialogue. I don't know if you know what a dialogue is. I learned this years ago. Dialogue means that I'm moving beyond just facts. And I'm starting to talk about my feelings about how things are and why things are the way they are and what this does for me. And it also means that when I'm hurt this way, that I start looking at you trying to understand what it is that's causing you to say this and to do this and to respond in this way. You know, my brother and I, he died a year and a half ago. But I found myself at times just wondering what in the world is going on with him, because it just took him a long time to get across the river. I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but I mean, some people cross the river at a narrow place, and some people, it just takes them forever to get across at the widest place. And I mean, he struggled with life. He had a hard time getting across the river. John had his difficulties in life. But the longer I lived, the more I understood where that was coming from. The more I realized what he didn't receive that I did receive. And why he would feel the way that he felt in his life. And why he would respond the way. And what it is that when we're struggling with these differences, go, take responsibility. And take responsibility to communicate with people in a way that helps them to take hold of the message that we're needing. And I think Jesus would then tell us that if we need help, we need to ask for it. Because just going and trying to work it out with somebody doesn't always work. Sometimes the issues are too deep, too strong, and so there are people. He's talking now about folks of faith who live around you. He's saying, take 2 or 3 with you. I found that to be such a crucial principle in life. That I can't I can't always communicate with somebody. I began realizing this when I was pastoring in Louisiana. Susan and I were there for nearly 6 years, and I had the biggest struggle with kindergarten in our church. And they were struggling with how Sunday school teachers were rearranging the rooms, and the Sunday school teachers were unhappy because the kindergarten teachers, and I got into struggles with the teacher, and the teacher and I were face to face one day in the room just talking, and I got louder and louder, and finally I said, I better back up and try some other approach to this. And I did. I asked our minister of education to help us, and we had a meeting and met in my office, and there was the teacher and her husband and the minister of education and the pastor. And we talked through it, and I'm telling you, the minister of education was such a big help to me. At one point in that conversation, the man was getting so upset about what I had said, and the minister of education said, "Look at me, Gene. Gene, just look at me." And he reached over and took Gene's face in his hands, and he turned him toward and said, "Look at me. I want you to hear what I want to say." I thought, he's about to hit that man. I mean, Gene was really upset. And now here is my friend helping us to connect, but he reached out and helped. Sometimes we need that kind of help, don't we? Sometimes we need to be asking other people to help us. Sometimes we need to be the helper. Sometimes we need to be the go-between. And he keeps talking about if those 2 or 3 witnesses don't help this to become what it ought to be, then he says take it before the church. Now I'm going to tell you, I'm not one of those people who believes in taking folks' problems and coming up before the church and saying, you know what, look at this problem this person has. I think that gets us into big trouble. I do think what Jesus is asking for here is for a larger understanding of this. Others, maybe in the congregation, maybe in the community of faith, maybe in the family, who can understand with us. And he's saying here they can pray with us. He's saying what he wanted, Jesus is saying is, whatever we bind on earth, whatever we bind is bound in heaven, whatever we loose on earth is loose in heaven, verse 18 and 19. And if 2 or 3 of you on earth agree together, it's going to happen. In other words, he's talking about prayer. When they ask God for something in his name, God's going to be there with us, and God is going to show us the way. We're talking about prayer here today and teaching our children about prayer and us believing in prayer and the importance of prayer. The disagreements in our lives need the power of prayer. They need the community as best we can. And I've come to believe that you have to have some group of people that you trust who can take confidentialities and can begin to pray on behalf of problems that exist in life. We live in this social media crummy world of ours that just rips people apart online and publicly debasing other people. And that's not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is communicating, asking others to help us resolve this. Let's not be tearing down. Let's be building up. And in the midst of all of that, let's be praying. Let's be praying that God's will can be accomplished in this situation. I don't know about you, but I do believe that we can resolve so many things if we'll pray. Susan and I have some good friends that we have known since Louisiana days, who are living together now, whose family life came back together after it fell apart. We had been there, we'd been friends, we'd been pastor and wife to them. And then we had moved away and their lives fell apart, not because we moved away, because they had all kinds of problems. I went back and began to consult with them, began to draw them towards some kind of healing process. We prayed. I asked them to pray, they prayed. They've been together now for all of these years because they figured out how to resolve their issues in their lives. You know what I think? The last thing I want to tell you is this. Jesus would say, if we're going to resolve our differences, we better learn how to forgive one another. We better learn how to say, I forgive you, and mean it from the depth of our being. We learn this. It is so hard to forgive. Our humanness gets in the way when we have these pains that come against us. But our inability to render forgiveness somehow blocks our ability to receive the forgiveness that God is wanting us to have. God has forgiven us, and this parable that he tells beginning in verse 23 all the way through verse 35, the parable that he tells about this person, this king or royalty who forgives his servant all this huge debt. And then this guy who has this debt forgiven that's like millions of days of income that he had to pay, couldn't pay back, and the king forgave him. And then he goes and he cannot forgive someone who had 100 days of debt that were owed to him. 100 denarii is the word. And he was blocked from receiving the great forgiveness of the king in his life. And that's what Jesus would help us to know, is you can't help everybody, by the way. Sometimes you got to shake the dust off your feet and move on. You've tried, you've worked at it, you can't. But his point is that we need to, as best as we can, no matter who it is or what the issue is, resolve it in our heart. And we release them from paying the price of what they've done, as we see it, by the way. We forgive. And what we discover is there's a freedom that comes to us. The greatest, I think, experience of forgiveness that I had from the Gaston clan came from my father when I was a kid, and about the time that my parents were still living in Freeport. And my dad owned a newspaper and had a big press, and I've told you this story to some of you years and years ago. But I worked for my dad. I was in the stuffer department. They had this press. They'd print section 1, then they'd print section 2, and I took section 2 and stuffed it inside of section 1 for delivery. So we had a whole paper. It was a big job, real responsible job, made a lot of money. But I was the stuffer, and I had a friend, Joe, my good friend, who helped me, and he was my assistant in the stuffing business. And it was a family business, and I mean, my sister worked there, my mother did some things, and my dad was the editor, publisher, editor of this thing. And it was a struggle. I mean, he had a hard time making ends meet. And one day the press broke down. Oh no, the press always broke down, but one day it didn't break down. They got through in a hurry, and the stuffers were still stuffing. And my dad wanted to leave, so he said, "Son, I'm going to leave this with you. Here's the key. I'm going home. Lock this place up when you're finished, and y'all come on home." So, got my bike. I can handle that. I can do that. After he left, I got to talking to Joe about how every machine in that office, I could run anything in there. I could do it all. I mean, there was a linotype over here, and I wanted to show him how you do that. And I worked on that for a minute. I said, well, I don't know. That's not it. But I'll tell you what, I can run this press over here. This thousands of dollars press. I forgot that at the end of every workday, they took the rubber rolls and dropped them down. And I didn't remember that. But I went over there and I flipped the switch on that thing. The belts were flopping, and the press was running. I said, no, all you got to do is take this big handle and you shove it into place. And I shoved it into place, and I heard this crunch. It went grung. I ran the top of the press up on top of the rollers, and I ruined thousands of dollars worth of equipment. My friend Joe was telling me all along, you better leave this stuff alone, man. Leave it alone. Don't do that. And after it happened, for some reason, I said, Joe, I tell you what we need to do. We need to go over here and raise this window and make it look like somebody came through here and did this. Oh, yes. But I am a preacher today, and I did get past that point in my life. And Joe said, you know what? That's not a bad idea. Let's do that. So we raised this window. We finished stuffing. We left. And I was a little late coming into the office the next morning. Summertime, I rode in because I wanted to give it plenty of time for things to settle. I got there were police cars outside of the building. I walked in and I could see these policemen walking around examining, looking for fingerprints and other evidence. And one of them went over to the window and he said, "Mr. Gaston, there are no footprints out here." He said, "I think somebody raised this window. Somebody on the inside tried to make it look like an outside job, and I think it was somebody in here who did this." And about that time, Dad looked at me like, okay, the stuffers have done this. He said, "Son, let's go in the office and talk for a minute." I must have begun doing this when I got walking through the door, because he said, "Wait, don't say anything yet. I want to tell you something." He said, "If you've done this, you need to tell me the truth. You need to let me know what it is that you have done. I can forgive that. But I can't forgive you lying about this like this." He said, I don't know that I could. And he said, "I want you to know that this is our family business. And if you've done this, you've hurt what we're trying to do here." I don't remember what I said to him. I tell you what I remember walking away with. And to this day, I remember that my father continued to love me and continued to accept me. And I had a price to pay, but I was not cast out. I saw forgiveness at work in the life of my father as he accepted me for some of the dumbest things I believe I had ever done and may have ever done along the way. And I was forgiven. You learn forgiveness by being forgiven and by seeing that forgiveness and by looking into the face of it. God's forgiveness is the big one. We look into His face, and then we turn and we learn how to love other people in spite of what they've done. Thanks be to God. We can live together. We can get past the toughest places if we'll just do it the way Jesus teaches us to do it. Take responsibility, get with it, love, and forgive. Let's sing together, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Isn't that a great song? Reminds us of His friendship and what it is that we need to be bringing into life. Let's sing together a couple of verses as the Lord speaks to you. Perhaps there's some decision you need to make today, and you'll come by after church and we can talk about that. Let's stand as we sing.
Hymn number 182. 182.